From Lancastrian princess to Yorkist queen, Anne Neville, who was the wife of Richard III, had a tumultuous life as she fought to survive the brutalities of the Wars of the Roses. Married off in her early teens into a family she'd been raised to think of as the enemy, her life was filled with reversals of fortune, unlikely alliances, and great grief, culminating in a tragic and, some said, highly suspicious death. Stay tuned to this week's video from History Calling to hear all about the life of this Plantagenet Queen of England. Anne Neville was born here at Warwick Castle on the 11th of June 1456, the daughter of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and his wife Anne Beauchamp, or Beauchamp. I'm going to go with Beauchamp. She was the second of their two children and had an older sister named Isabel, born in 1451. As their parents would never produce a male heir, these two girls were therefore great heiresses. One of her biographers, Amy Licence, suggests that she may have spent time in what was still the English-controlled Calais as a child, while her father was captain of Calais, but we have no direct evidence of this. In fact, we know very little for certain about her childhood at all. What we do know, though, is that it, and her entire life in fact, would be shaped by the ongoing saga that was the Wars of the Roses. This conflict dated back to Edward III, or rather to his children, and I've already covered it in my earlier videos on the Wars of the Roses, so apologies to those of you for whom this is old news. Edward had 5 surviving sons, but by the time he died in 1377, his eldest, Edward Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince, was already dead. The throne therefore went to the prince's son, who became Richard II, and by the way, the yellow lines indicate marriages and the blue lines indicate offspring. Richard had no children, and according to the rules of primogeniture, his heir was Edmund, Earl of March, who was a descendant of Edward III's second surviving son, Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence. However, in 1399, Richard II was deposed by his first cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who was the son of Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and his first wife, Blanche of Lancaster. Bolingbroke became Henry IV, and Richard II died soon afterwards, having probably been murdered. Henry IV's eldest son became Henry V, then his son by the French princess, Catherine of Valois, became Henry VI in 1422, at the age of just 9 months. This is the man who was on the throne when Anne Neville was born. But as this branch of the Plantagenets were descended from Edward III's third son, their blood claim on the throne was arguably weaker than the descendants of his second son, Lionel of Antwerp. Lionel's descendant, Edmund, Earl of March, was long dead and had had no children, but he had passed his claim to the throne to his sister, Anne Mortimer. She had married her distant cousin, Richard, Earl of Cambridge, who, just to confuse things, was also a descendant of Edward III, this time through his fourth son, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. So we have the descendants of John of Gaunt, who are known as the Lancastrians because he was the Duke of Lancaster, and we have the descendants of Lionel of Antwerp and Edmund of Langley, who are known as the Yorks because Edmund was Duke of York. The Lancastrians hold the throne at the time of Anne's birth because Henry IV had seized it, but the Yorks have a better blood claim on it because they are descended from an older son of Edward III. The idea of roses comes from the fact that one of the badges sometimes used by the House of Lancaster was a red rose, while one of the badges sometimes used by the House of York was a white rose. Now I'm going to show you where Anne fits into all of this. For that, we need to go back to John of Gaunt. After the death of his first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, he married again in 1371 to Constance of Castile. They had no surviving sons, but John had a mistress, Catherine Swynford, with whom he had 3 sons and a daughter, born between 1372 and 1381. The eldest of these would be the progenitor of the Tudor line, but it was from the daughter, Joan, that Anne descended. John of Gaunt later married Catherine Swynford and had these children retroactively declared legitimate, with a later caveat added by Henry IV which stipulated that they and their descendants were unable to inherit the throne. But none of that really mattered to Anne because as Joan's descendant, she wouldn't have been in line for the throne anyway. It is therefore quite ironic that she nevertheless ended up sitting on it, albeit as a consort. That's in the future, however. For now, let's return to her childhood. As I mentioned, the person on the throne at the time of Anne's birth was the now adult Henry VI. Had he been a strong-minded medieval monarch, also willing to slice and dice some of his family members on occasion to neutralise their claims to the throne, the Wars of the Roses might never have happened. But he wasn't. Instead, he was one of England's weakest kings, easily led by his advisers. His wife was the French princess Margaret of Anjou, and together they had just one child, Edward, Prince of Wales, born in 1453 during a period of time when his father had suffered a complete mental breakdown and was in a catatonic state. Anne's father, Lord Warwick, was not on good terms with the royal household, especially Queen Margaret, and was instead a supporter of his uncle by marriage, the Duke of York. York was second in line to the throne after the infant Prince of Wales, and was named Protector of the Realm during the King's incapacitation, and again for 3 months in late 1455 and early 1456, for reasons which are less clear. 3 of his sons, Edward, George and Richard, would play pivotal roles in Anne's life in the years to come, and just so you know, there was another named Edmund, but he doesn't come into the story very much for reasons which will soon become apparent. Anne was probably too young to really understand what was happening in the late 1450s and early 1460s, but her father, Lord Warwick, and paternal grandfather, the Earl of Salisbury, were engaged in serious fighting on behalf of the Yorks, as the Duke, and later his eldest son, fought to obtain the throne from Henry VI. The Duke had been indicted for treason in 1459, leading to a York-Lancastrian clash at the Battle of Blore Heath on the 23rd of September that year, at which Lord Salisbury was victorious. 3 weeks later, the tables were turned at Ludford Bridge near Ludlow Castle, when the Yorks found themselves outnumbered and were forced to flee England entirely. The Duke and his second oldest son, Edmund, went to Ireland, while Anne's father, grandfather, and York's eldest son, Edward, went to Calais. We don't know where Warwick's wife and 2 young daughters were during all of this. Perhaps they had never left Calais in the first place, or perhaps they were back at Warwick Castle while the battles raged. Either way, the family were together in the French city that autumn, while back in England, Acts of Attainder were passed against York, Warwick, and Salisbury. The following year, Anne's father returned to England, and at the Battle of Northampton on the 10th of July 1460, the Yorks won the day, taking King Henry prisoner and forcing Margaret of Anjou and her son to flee north to Scotland. On the 31st of October, an Act of Accord was passed, stating that the throne would go from Henry VI to the Duke of York, and then to his offspring, completely cutting the young Prince of Wales out of his inheritance. The wheel of fate continued to spin, however. The Duke of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield Cross on the 30th of December 1460, as was his second oldest son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, and Anne's grandfather, the Earl of Salisbury, though Salisbury had actually survived the initial battle and was taken as a prisoner to Pontefract, where he was killed by a mob the following day. His head was put on a spike at the gates of the city of York, where it sat beside the Duke's, which had a paper crown placed on it to mock his pretensions to the throne. These were terrible blows to the Neville family, but they and the Yorks fought on. Edward won the Battle of Mortimer's Cross at the start of February, while Anne's father was defeated at the Second Battle of St Albans on the 17th of that month and lost Henry VI, who he had brought with him, when the king was rescued by his own forces. The Lancastrians quickly lost the upper hand, though, when Londoners refused to allow them into the city, fearing the pillaging that the unruly army would subject them to, and instead they had to retreat north while Edward entered the capital. He was declared King Edward IV on the 4th of March and solidified the victory with a win at the Battle of Towton on the 29th. The ousted royal family fled into Scotland the next day. Little Anne and her family were now back on the winning side, and with her father promoted to Admiral of England and Edward's lieutenant in the north, it was time for Lady Warwick and her 2 daughters to return to their homeland and move into Middleham Castle. Amy Licence suggests that Anne may have been at Edward IV's coronation in Westminster Abbey in June 1461, but there is no record to prove this one way or the other, and as she was still only 5 years old, she may have been deemed too young. We do know, however, that she was at the reburial of her grandfather, Lord Salisbury, at Bisham Abbey in February 1463. He'd originally been interred in the friary at Pontefract. By September 1465 at the latest, and it might have been as early as 1461, a boy who would become one of the most important people in her life had also arrived to live with the family at Middleham. This was the new king's youngest brother, Richard, now nearly 13 years old and known as the Duke of Gloucester. Despite the age gap and gender difference, these two children certainly spent at least some time together. In 1465, for example, they, along with Anne's sister Isabel, sat together at the celebrations for the enthronement of the girl's uncle, George Neville, as Archbishop of York. By this stage, things were beginning to sour between Edward IV and the Earl of Warwick, however, in part because of Edward's scandalous and secret marriage to the Lancastrian widow Elizabeth Woodville in 1464, which he only acknowledged several months later while Warwick was trying to arrange a foreign match for him. Over the next 5 years, the relationship between these once close cousins would disintegrate until only one of them was left alive. In February 1469, the now 16-year-old Duke of Gloucester was declared to be of age and left Middleham. His departure came not a moment too soon, for the problems between his brother and their Warwick cousin were about to erupt. Already enraged at the preference shown to Queen Elizabeth's family, the Earl's nose was put further out of joint by Edward's refusal to allow him to marry off his elder daughter, Isabel, to the other royal brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Refusing to accept this, Warwick and Clarence, who had pretensions to be king someday as his brother did not yet have a legitimate son, obtained a papal dispensation which would allow the Duke to marry the daughter of his cousin, and they took Isabel to Calais, where George wed her on the 11th of July. The 13-year-old Anne was there too to take part in the celebrations. It wasn't to be long before she was married as well, but the identity of her husband would prove quite the plot twist. Lord Warwick and the Duke of Clarence returned to England almost immediately after the wedding, leaving the new Duchess and her younger sister behind in France. Once there, they set about toppling King Edward. At first, things went their way. They won the Battle of Edgecote on the 26th of July, executed the Queen's father and brother, and Edward himself, though he hadn't been at the battle, was soon taken prisoner and sent first to Warwick Castle, then Middleham. Isabel and Anne were brought over from France, and it seemed that Warwick and Clarence would now rule England in the name of the imprisoned king. The regime change didn't last long, though. The pair found themselves unable to maintain order, and Edward had to be released in the early autumn. There was a brief show of forgiveness and solidarity between Edward and George, but pretty soon Clarence and Warwick were back to their old tricks, and this time they looked to someone very unexpected indeed for support. Despite having been pardoned by Edward, the king was still very suspicious of his cousin and brother, and his suspicions were borne out when the pair rebelled again in early 1470. Once more they were defeated and they fled to France, taking a heavily pregnant Isabel and her sister Anne along with them. It was a disaster for the teenage Duchess. Refused entry to the port of Calais in mid-April by Edward's lieutenant there, Isabel went into labour on the boat and was delivered of a stillborn or very short-lived child, gender unknown, who was most likely buried at sea. Who knows if Anne was in the cabin or not for the birth, but she must have been able to hear her sister's screams and witnessed her grief firsthand. The family finally landed at Normandy on the 1st of May, and, running low on options, Warwick and Clarence now proved the truth of the old maxim that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, for they turned to none other than Margaret of Anjou. Queen Margaret and her son had been living in poverty, by royal standards, in France for some years, while her husband, Henry VI, had been captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London back in 1465. The chances of getting the throne back looked minimal indeed, and then into her lap fell her old enemy, the Earl of Warwick. She was just as suspicious of him as King Edward was, and a deal with her was only brokered after much negotiating, some of it with Warwick on his knees at her feet, and the intercession of Louis of France. Anne was to form a central part of the agreement. Though she herself had been sent off to Valogne near Barfleur with George and Isabel, her marriage was now arranged with great haste, as it was decided that she would wed Margaret's son, Edward, Prince of Wales, who was by now 16 years old. The marriage would be a step down for him, but up for Anne, especially if she ended up becoming queen. On the 25th of July, the couple were officially betrothed, which was practically as good as a marriage at this point, at the Cathedral of Anjou. Soon after, Warwick went back to England to fight for the throne with troops paid for by Louis, who demanded support in a war against Burgundy in return. He left Anne, as well as her mother and possibly Isabel, though we don't really know where she was, as quasi-hostages with her almost in-laws, and on the 31st of July, this group went to the French royal residence of Amboise, where they spent the summer. In England, things went remarkably well, at first. Warwick succeeded in taking London while Edward was out of the city, and released Henry VI from the Tower, restoring him, in name at least, to the throne. Edward and his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, were forced to flee into exile on mainland Europe, while his wife and children had to go into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. The Lancastrian royals returned to Paris in November, but did not set sail to England right away. Instead, they delayed, possibly, according to licence, to await the papal dispensation needed for Anne and Prince Edward to complete their marriage. It arrived, and they were duly wed on the 13th of December at Bayeux. The 14-year-old Anne was now officially the Lancastrian Princess of Wales. In March 1471, Edward IV and his brother Richard returned to England, and the Duke of Clarence, who seems to have finally realised the obvious, which is that he was never going to be king after a Lancastrian restoration, defected back to them. Edward retook London, re-imprisoned Henry VI, and at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April, Warwick was killed. It was the very same day that Queen Margaret, Prince Edward, Anne, Princess of Wales, and her mother landed back in England, expecting it to be under Lancastrian control. When they heard what had happened, Anne's mother, who had arrived on a separate ship, went into sanctuary in Beaulieu Abbey, leaving Anne with her in-laws. After a brief stay at Cerne Abbey, the party set off for Wales, hoping to meet up with Jasper Tudor, who was the half-uncle of King Henry. They never made it. Edward IV caught up with them at Tewkesbury on the 4th of May, and in the ensuing battle, Anne's husband was killed. She and her mother-in-law had been sheltering in Malvern Abbey, but when they heard the news from the battlefield, they moved to a church near Tewkesbury. It was from there that they were taken prisoner on the 6th of May and brought to Edward IV at Coventry, where they met him on the 11th. Margaret was taken to London, where her husband mysteriously died in the Tower on the same day she arrived there, the 21st of May, though probably not on the spot marked by this plaque. See my video on his death to hear more about the rumours he was murdered and the accusations that it was Richard of Gloucester who did the deed. The former queen was eventually sent back to France, where she died in poverty. Anne was given to her brother-in-law, the Duke of Clarence, to be held in his and her sister Isabel's custody, and may have lived with them at their house at Cold Harbour. A childless widow of barely 15 and a major heiress, the question now became, who would she marry next? From George's point of view, he didn't want his sister-in-law to remarry at all. As Isabel's husband, he took control of the vast Warwick inheritance, though some northern lands were granted to Richard of Gloucester, and kept Anne and her mother from their property. At some point, though, Richard expressed an interest in marrying Anne, and perhaps Anne expressed the same. Some have ascribed this to an enduring love which had sprung up during their childhood at Middleham, and they may have felt genuine affection for each other. However, we don't know what their feelings were, and there were other far more practical reasons for wanting to marry each other. There were few people of sufficiently high rank in the country and of the appropriate age for a brother of the king and an ex-princess of Wales to wed, and allying with Anne would give Richard access to her extraordinary wealth that his untrustworthy and frequently traitorous brother Clarence was currently hogging, thanks to his marriage to Isabel. I know it's romantic to think that the two were already in love, but had she not been the joint heiress of the Earl of Warwick, I really don't think Richard would have looked twice at her as a bride. It was his brother Edward who was prone to making socially unsuitable marriages. Yes, I'm looking at you, Elizabeth Woodville, and nothing in Richard's conduct suggests that this was a trait he shared with the king. From Anne's point of view, the marriage would lift her out of the disgrace she had suffered thanks to her union with the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, free her from George's control, bring her further into the York royal family, and make her a duchess, with her own household to run. George wasn't happy at the thought of having to share with his younger brother, and we have an extraordinary and unverifiable story from the Crowland Chronicle about the lengths he went to keep Anne and Richard apart. The anonymous author of this chronicle says that he, meaning George, caused the damsel to be concealed, in order that it might not be known by his brother where she was, as he was afraid of a division of the Earl's property, which he wished to come to himself alone in right of his wife, and not to be obliged to share it with any other person. Still, however, the craftiness of the Duke of Gloucester so far prevailed that he discovered the young lady in the city of London disguised in the habit of a cookmaid, upon which he had her removed to the sanctuary of St. Martin's, meaning the church of St. Martin le Grand. Whether this former princess really was dressed up as a kitchen servant, we'll never know, but there were certainly huge rows between the brothers regarding her fate. Eventually, though, Richard was triumphant. We don't know when he and Anne were married, but there was an initial agreement made as to how the estate would be divided up in March 1472, and they likely wed at some point after that. We only know for sure, however, that they were husband and wife before July 1474, with Anne taking the title of the Duchess of Gloucester. Acts of Parliament were used to divide the Warwick inheritance up between the two sisters, and their mother was declared legally dead so that they could take her property too. The Gloucesters obtained lands in Wales and the north of England, and it was in the latter that they primarily resided. Like her mother and sister, though, the new Duchess was not to have a large family. Instead, she and Richard had only one surviving child, a boy named Edward of Middleham, born somewhere between 1473 and 1476. A document from 1483 describes him as being about 7, but this observer might have been mistaken in his age. The suffix of Middleham indicates that this is where Anne gave birth to him, in her own childhood home. Michael Hicks, writing in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, states that she may have had another son there too, called George, but if so, this child lived only briefly. Anne then spent much of her time as Duchess of Gloucester in the north of England, with Middleham Castle as the family's primary base. As with so much of her life, we know relatively little about her time there, but she did deputise for Richard on occasion, such as her appearance in York on his behalf when he was away campaigning in France in 1475. There were visits to London too, including at the end of that year, and in July 1476 she and Isabel may have joined their husbands and sister-in-law, Queen Elizabeth, at the reinterment of the remains of their father and brother-in-law, the Duke of York and Edmund, Earl of Rutland, at Fotheringhay. If so, it was likely the last time Anne saw her sister. Isabel was then heavily pregnant, having already produced 2 surviving children, Margaret and Edward, and she gave birth to another boy at the start of October. On the 22nd of December, however, she died at Tewkesbury, aged only 25. The baby expired too on New Year's Day. The Duchess of Clarence seems to have died of postpartum complications, but George went berserk, insisting she had been poisoned by an old serving woman named Anchoret Twinnow, who he had judicially murdered in April, practically usurping Edward's power as king in order to do so. He then complained when 3 men of his household were accused of imagining the king's death and burst into a council meeting to argue their case. He was also spreading stories questioning Edward's legitimacy. The king's patience with his brother had run out. George was arrested in July, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and convicted of treason by Act of Attainder. He was executed by drowning in wine on the 16th of February 1478. Anne and Richard had each lost a sibling in little more than a year, but we have no surviving evidence to tell us what the Duchess of Gloucester made of this series of events. All we can do is assume that once the dust had settled, life went on at Middleham as before. 5 years later, though, there was to be an even greater upheaval within the royal family, and this one would force Anne out of her home in the north and catapult her into a position she likely hadn't imagined herself in since the death of her first husband, that of Queen of England. In early April 1483, Edward IV died suddenly, aged only 40, and the events which followed over the succeeding 3 months are some of the most infamous in English history. Initially, the throne passed to his 12-year-old son, who became Edward V, and who was then at Ludlow in Shropshire in the care of his mother's brother, Lord Rivers, and one of her sons from her first marriage, Richard Grey. They were travelling to London for his coronation when Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had come south from Yorkshire, dramatically intervened. Imprisoning and eventually executing Rivers and Grey, he took custody of the young king, brought him to London, and placed him in the Tower, ostensibly to prepare for his coronation. Queen Elizabeth and her other children had fled into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, but Gloucester had his agents induce the Dowager Queen to surrender her younger boy, yet another Richard, which I know is very confusing, who joined his brother in the Tower. These two children, known to history as the Princes in the Tower, quickly disappeared, never to be seen again. I have a whole video looking at this episode, so I'm not going to go into further detail here, except to say that having examined all the available evidence, I'm of the opinion that Gloucester had them killed. Having declared his brother's marriage to Elizabeth unlawful and their children illegitimate, on the 26th of June he took the crown as Richard III, with Anne as his queen. But what of the new queen? She had remained in Yorkshire during April and May, but arrived in London in early June before her husband took the throne and moved into Crosby Place. Her initial intention in going there had probably been to attend her nephew Edward V's coronation, and we don't know what she made of the situation she found, if she encouraged Richard in his aspirations, or if she could do no more than stand by, aghast, as events unfolded around her. She may well have been present at Baynard's Castle, the home of her mother-in-law / great-aunt Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, when Richard accepted the crown. On the 4th of July, the royal couple spent the night in the Tower of London. I'd love to know if their nephews were still alive in there somewhere at the same time, but we don't, unfortunately. Then travelled through the city together to Westminster on the 5th, with Anne in a litter, her hair down, and a golden circlet upon her head. The following day, they were crowned together in Westminster Abbey with Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor, one of the women carrying Anne's train. Her tenure as queen wasn't to last long, however. 2 weeks after the coronation, they embarked on a royal progress which took them first to Windsor, where Anne stayed, while Richard went on into the north to Warwick. She joined him at the castle where she had been born in August, from where they moved on to Pontefract Castle on the 15th, then York. It was there, on the 8th of September, that their own son, Edward of Middleham, who had remained in the north this whole time, was formally invested as Prince of Wales, with both his parents in attendance. Anne then stayed at Middleham with him for a time before returning to London, where the king had just seen off an attempt by Lady Margaret Beaufort, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and his own cousin and sometime ally, the Duke of Buckingham, to oust him from the throne in favour of Henry Tudor. Anne spent considerable time at the Palace of Greenwich, as her predecessors had done, though the king and queen kept Christmas at Westminster while their son remained in Yorkshire. Early in 1484, her nieces, the now delegitimised princesses Elizabeth, Cecily, Anne, Catherine and Bridget of York, came out of sanctuary in Westminster Abbey and were placed in Queen Anne's household, though their mother remained behind. Her niece and nephew from George and Isabel, Lady Margaret and the little Earl of Warwick, also came into her care. It was one big, totally dysfunctional family. It was also a family that was about to lose another of its members. Whilst on progress in March 1484 and staying in Nottingham Castle, the king and queen received the worst possible news. Their only child, Edward, Prince of Wales, had died at Middleham. To this day, we don't know what killed the prince, except that it was illness rather than injury, nor do we know where he was buried, but his parents arrived at the castle by the 5th of May to arrange his funeral. His loss was a double blow for Anne. Not only did she have the grief of losing her child, but without him her own position was much more vulnerable. Her husband was in desperate need of an heir. The young Earl of Warwick was now the best claimant, despite the uncertainty over his position caused by his father's attainder. But despite being not quite 28, she was unable to give him one. Soon there were rumours that her husband was on the hunt for a second wife, and by Christmas 1484 there was speculation that his eye had fallen on his own niece, Elizabeth of York. These rumours have never been proven one way or the other, and although it would have been theoretically possible to get a papal dispensation for such a marriage, this level of incest was never a feature of English royalty. It is also hard to imagine Elizabeth marrying the man she likely believed had killed her brothers. Still, the gossip was enough that Richard ultimately had to put out a statement saying that he had never intended to take her as his wife, and the stories circulating about the two of them must have made Anne's life increasingly miserable. It was not an existence she would have to endure for long, though, for by the start of 1485, the Queen's health was in terminal decline. The end came on the 16th of March at the Palace of Westminster, supposedly during a solar eclipse. We don't know what killed the Queen, who was just 28 years old, and there was speculation that she was poisoned in order to get her out of the way and clear a path for Richard's remarriage, but speculation is all it is. Modern scholars have suggested illnesses such as cancer or tuberculosis, but again, this is just supposition with virtually no primary source evidence to support it, beyond some accounts that she died quickly of an illness, having only fallen sick after Christmas. She had been queen for less than 21 months, one of the shortest tenures of any consort in English history. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, though the exact location is unknown, and the 20th century plaque you see here was simply erected close to where it was thought she might have been buried. It's a very quiet end to a life often overshadowed by the men around her. Richard did not long outlive her, dying on the 22nd of August at the Battle of Bosworth, and thus ending the Plantagenet dynasty's hold over England. In his place came Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, and it was he who married Elizabeth of York and began a new chapter in the country's history. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about Anne's life. It is unfortunate that she's one of those historical figures for whom we don't have a great deal of information beyond some standout moments in her life, like her first marriage and coronation, but her story is nevertheless intriguing thanks to the many ups and downs she endured during her short time here on Earth. If you've enjoyed this content, please remember to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button underneath the video and switch on the notification bell so that YouTube lets you know every time I upload. You can also find me over on Instagram and on Patreon, where I provide bonus material including mini podcasts and early access to ad-free videos. These are both linked below for you. A quick thank you too to those of you who already support me on Patreon or by making one-off donations to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos for your great generosity and support. Let me know in the comments below if you think Anne's marriage to Richard was a love match or a strategic union. And for more on this period of English history, do check out my Wars of the Roses playlist. I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.